well, Guam is our ancestral homeland, it's the homeland of the Chamorro people. We've been here for thousands of years. And not just Guam. I mean, Guam, the Chamorro people inhabit the entire archipelago, the Mariana Islands, right? So it's also, historically, our islands were divided. So Guam, is the largest and southernmost island in that archipelago, but all the other northerns were politically organized under the rubric of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. But now, fast forward through many fits and starts through our history, they're also a U.S. territory. They tried to bargain in the 70s for a status that was actually more autonomous, etc. But clearly that didn't shake out the way so many even of the negotiators thought it would. I mean, the U.S. has really sort of just treated it as it's just a colony. And that's the simplest way to put it, is that just to be really clear about the language. We're not using colony in any sort of metaphorical sense. Guam is an actual colony, meaning the United Nations, the international community, recognizes Guam officially as a colony of the United States. The language that the UN uses to describe Guam is a non-self-governing territory, so meaning we have a prima facie case established. We don't have to argue that we have a right to decolonization, because it's like this is what this remedy is for. But to the US, it's much simpler, it's a strategic military outpost. I mean, it is, and now with all of the sort of drummed up sort of, war going rhetoric around China, and containing China. I mean, we saw this clearly in just like every single administration. I mean, this probably this probably was really stamped during the Obama years under the rubric of the Pacific pivot, or the Asia Pacific pivot, sometimes it's called. But essentially this idea that even Hillary Clinton, I remember in 2011, went to Hawaii at the East West Center and ominously announced that this is, in every single way conceivable, America's Pacific century. So what this means is that the U.S. will project its power from here. It will contain China's rise from here. I mean, the containment, all of this, you see it with the brand new release Global Posture Review. You see it with this massive budget, that the Congress keeps just feeding the war machine. That's why I always say, let's go back to the original version, call it the military industrial congressional complex, because Congress is absolutely right in there with them, just cooking up in this terrible sordid kitchen, all these sort of monstrous dishes. I mean, they're all doing it together. I mean, and now, now in 2022, we see it all, all of these sort of dreams of the imperialists have come, are fully formed. I mean, we have a brand new Marine Corps base. We have additional troops being sent to Guam. They're beefing up military presence in Australia. We have AUKUS now, we had Quad, AUKUS. We have so many things, and it's so sad if you take a long view, because, the troops just left Afghanistan. Now it's China. It's just, we are so naive to think that it's almost like this aberration, when it's absolutely a system that is working perfectly well, because this is what the system was created to do, and so that's why that is the Guam in the U.S. imagination. It's where America's Day begins. It's the tip of the spear. It's the place, but honestly, if you really sort of, if you know your history, you also know that, all this sort of pretend, all this make-believe about defending Guam, the U.S. is sort of, the rhetoric it uses to justify this huge, enormous budget, and the huge, just obscene amounts of money that are being spent to militarize Guam and to defend Guam. But actually, if you really look at history, the U.S. also left, also knew that Japan was about to bomb Guam and left. They loaded all of their U.S. military personnel and some of their dependents onto a ship that had splashed the word aloha on it, and they went away, which is Guam also, there's so many connections, with just the way the U.S. Sort of imperial imagination works. It doesn't even have an ability to understand which island it's on. It's all the same, aloha is the same. So it's all part of it, it's because we are all lumped into this other, and we have all been in this otherness, for a long time, but clearly since 1898, America's imperial meridian, when the U.S. decided to make a go of it, the classic colonial game, imperial game of collecting overseas colonies, and running that, forever. I mean, and we still have the legacy of it now. We have the insular cases, which have never been overturned. We see that in federal Indian law with the doctrine of discovery ever since, the Cherokee cases, the Marshall Trilogy case. I mean, like we can go on, and there's so many ways. I mean, it's a game in some ways. That's why, like, for me, when I'm teaching, I'm also like a part-time law professor, but rarely these days. Like, I actually love, like, I would love to teach federal Indian law more, just because that is such a perfect body of law, because it robs you of any illusion about what's happening here. You know what I mean? These legal fictions that are born of thin air, that are used, as to provide constitutional cover to all kinds of imperial games. It's exactly the same. I mean, they function toward the exact same end. The doctrine of discovery and the territorial incorporation doctrine, born of the insular cases. We're locked in it together. I mean, even now with this whole political versus racial binary, like with Morton versus Mankari, Rice versus Cayetano. I can go on, but this is boring. But I mean, you know what I'm saying, right?
No. Maybe you can break down the case, the Davis v. Guam case, because I think it resonates with some of it resonates with the Brackeen v. Holland Supreme Court case that's going through, the docket right now. But maybe you can break it down, because I think it's important, because it's not, break it. You're the lawyer. You're the expert. Break it down for us.
Basically, Nick, in 2011, a retired U.S. military personnel member who had moved to Guam and then, like Guam or whatever, decided to stay, had sued the government of Guam for violations of the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, equal protection, the 14th Amendment, and the Guam's Organic Act, as well as the Voting Rights Act, right? So we have this case where, just like in Hawaii, all of these sort of Reconstruction of era amendments, are now being weaponized and deployed actually again, in service of people who historically never needed its protection. So it was a white plaintiff who benefited from Rice versus Cayetano, from the 15th Amendment. It's really mind blowing when you really think about it, I mean, and if you trace it, it's not just legally, it's the political narrative that accompanies the cases. For example, Breitbart came out in support of this case, accusing Guam of being the new Jim Crow. It was like the fallacy of false equivalence, like white is the new black. And it's all the same. We have no historical memory. We don't understand that at the heart of these Reconstruction amendments is a beating heart of anti-subordination. That's its animating principle. That's its justification, And now we have these Reconstruction amendments being used against indigenous peoples who fall outside of the very narrow category provided by Morton versus Mankari. That's basically the political classification doctrine. Essentially, when a legal challenge is brought under the 14th Amendment or otherwise, it's brought by a plaintiff challenging a tribe's ability to do X, Y, or Z, right? And the court, at least in the wake of Morton versus Mankari, sort of always sees it's another legal fiction in a way, but it's to benefit tribes in many instances, and that is they shield it from legal challenge by calling it a political as opposed to a racial classification, even if the classification itself is actually partly racial or partly ancestral. But they call it a political challenge, and you get to insulate it from a lawsuit, right? Or you at least get to prevail. So with our case, there are indigenous peoples who are not federally recognized that fall really clearly outside of that. You have to have federal recognition to have the benefit of that classification. For example, this is why in Hawaii, Native Hawaiians have long struggled, toiled, and debated over whether or not to try to have a status akin to a federally recognized Indian tribe, but they only want it for purposes of shielding those, programs, like these statutes, for example, that designate benefits for Native Hawaiians from constitutional challenge. Enter Guam. Guam is still a UN recognized colony. Our people are colonized. We are awaiting a decolonization referendum, and that's what the white plaintiff in Davis versus Guam challenged. They said to deny him, who I think he's originally from Texas and not colonized, but he moves to Guam and he argues that to deny him the right to vote in a purely symbolic political status plebiscite And that is a vote whereby those who are colonized or descendants of the colonized group get in a voting box and make a symbolic gesture about whether or not they want independence, statehood or integration, or free association, right? These are internationally recognized options to effectuate self-determination. And then the plaintiff argued that this is reverse race discrimination. It's a classic thing, we see it everywhere. But the court agreed. Federal courts across this country are consistent in one way. They are all consistently accepting that deceptively simple framing of the plaintiff. Saying that these indigenous groups who are trying to basically exclude anyone else who's not a part of the colonized polity are violating these, sets of amendments. So this is so the court agreed, the Ninth Circuit agreed with the lower court, and then the SCOTUS denied certiorari. So what that basically means is that right now, at least at this point, the Guam statute authorizing this purely symbolic vote, it's on hold. There is no vote that can be had now. So the colonized people, Guam, my people, can't even express a purely symbolic desire, about their future political relationship with the United States. So when you really sort of take all of these if you take these sort of opinions and the logic that feeds into them to their ultimate conclusion, what you're saying actually, you're left in a terrible constitutional place where you neither have the protections of a federal recognition that Indian tribes get to shield under the political classification doctrine, nor do you have the ability to actually even name the group of colonized people you're trying to ask a question. Because the act of naming them as a colonized group is considered ancestral, and then it's considered a racial categorization. And I don't want to go into it any more because it's a little nuanced about what is an ancestral versus what is a racial classification. But suffice it to say that it is the latest sort of iteration, of just this long, at this point, very long, historical project of sort of obliterating the original purpose of those Reconstruction amendments.